Okay, hi. Before I start, I should probably say that there's no image to go with this voice. So it's nothing to do with you. It's on my end. I just don't have a camera or anything yet. But considering it's just gonna be you looking at my bloody mug for however long this thing takes, I don't think you're missing out much. Okay. Anyway, this little chat of mine is just a few of my thoughts on some elements of Christianity, inspired by watching a lot of videos by various atheists on YouTube. Feel free to write me or, put in any comments down, Okay, anyway. The thing that really irritates me, I guess, about a lot of Christians is that they essentially cherry pick the bits of the religion they like. Now, I think if you're a Christian and you believe, for whatever reason, that Jesus is a good man, a right man, and that what he taught and did was the best way to be, then, it's your duty to try to determine what he actually did say and do and teach. Okay. Now, there's no way to be absolutely sure what Jesus said or did, or taught, even. I mean, we only know what he is purported to have said, done, taught. Okay, you might say, Brian, but isn't that the same with everything? Isn't that the same with the Holocaust? I mean, you didn't live through it. You only have history and reports, so how do you know it happened? Well, okay, bad example, as lots of people who lived through the Holocaust and suffered from it are still alive today. But what about another example? What about, say, stuff that happened so long ago that no one is even conceivably alive to tell the tale, unless you're Highlander, like the Battle of Hastings? Well, there's a lot of evidence of all kinds, from plenty of sources, to say that Hastings 1066 happened, and that the English lost, Harold was killed, and that William of Normandy, known variously as the Conqueror or the Bastard, from 1066 right up into this present day, in fact, conquered England. I mean, he conquered England. End of. There's so much evidence, you can't deny it. But it's not so simple with the Bible. There are, simply put, no contemporaneous sources of what Jesus said or taught. The earliest dated gospel or fragment of the Bible that I know of was written about 30 years after Jesus supposedly died. In fact, it's highly doubtful that any of the surviving documents were written by anyone who ever knew Jesus, let alone by Jesus himself. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, what it means is, if you're a Christian, and therefore hold the teachings of Jesus above anything else that may be in the Bible, the only way it should be if you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, you should hold Jesus' teachings above everything else in the Bible. If there's contradictions, what Jesus says goes, if you ask me, if you're a Christian. Well, then you're never going to know for sure what Jesus taught, believed, thought, said, or did. You can get close to knowing what he probably did believe and taught. And the way you do that is to study, throughout your life, all the things that Jesus is purported to have said or done. Now, that's the key. Lots of religious folk do study the Bible their whole lives in an attempt to get closer to God and to Jesus. But there's a problem with that, and that is that they use the Bible to justify the Bible, as many people, including Gisburn 2000, not his birth name, I'm sure, have pointed out. Now, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, you may or may not know this, but there are several Gospels and testaments of Jesus' deeds, thoughts, and teachings in life that are not in the Bible. You might say, what? Huh? But it's true. There are many documents, genuine documents, such as the Gospel of Thomas or Stephen. Stephen, I think, is another one. Mary, too, I believe. And, you can look these up on the web. Wikipedia even has it, bloody hell. But yeah, you can look it up on reputable sources on the web, and these are rival accounts of the life of Jesus. These are accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus, just as the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were, except these Gospels aren't in the Bible. They didn't make their way in. They didn't make the cut. And I guess, yeah. So anyway, indeed, there were, in fact, many more Gospels and fragments than even we have now. Because most were destroyed by the early church as they contained certain elements that, didn't conform to the version of Christianity that the church was espousing. I mean, just Google some of these alternative gospels I mentioned, like Thomas or Stephen or Mary. Google the early church, the Council of Nicaea, and you'll get quite a lot of info, so there's no need for me to go into it. I mean, particularly since this bloody chat's probably going to take long enough as it is. But anyway, so many of these sources are at odds with the biblical teachings, but it's only by studying them that, one is going to come to a better understanding of what Jesus felt and taught and did and thought, I mean, just look them up. If you really are a Christian, look them up and come to your own conclusions about what Jesus thought, because they are just as legitimate as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John and everything else in the Bible. They're just as legitimate. The only reason they're not in there is because they don't conform in certain parts to the main reason they're not in the gospel in the Bible is because these other gospels don't conform to certain elements of traditional Christian dogma. Okay, so the main point of this sort of chat is about the hypocrisy of a good deal, although not all, Christians. And to be a true Christian, as I've already said, and to reiterate, in my humble opinion, you must earnestly seek out all documented evidence of Jesus, what he did, what he said, what he thought, and try to determine on that how Jesus said one should live and how Jesus reckons the universe works. Okay, so what? In other words, what Jesus said and did overrides and takes precedence over everything else in the Bible. Okay, fair enough, right? I mean, that's not in debate. Okay. In the New Testament, Jesus says, I've not come to do away with the old laws and teachings, that is, of the Old Testament. And many Christians say, okay, because of this, because of what Jesus said, the Old Testament and its rules and laws are still in effect. However, there are times when Jesus does specifically do away with things set out in the Old Testament. For instance, and here's a passage we all know, even non-religious folk like me, Jesus says in Matthew 5:38 to 42, you may have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which is in the Old Testament. But now I say to you that if a man strikes your right cheek, you should turn the other cheek so that he must strike that one too. And if a soldier gets you to carry his backpack 1 mile, you should carry that too. And he goes on in this vein. He gives a few more examples too, does Jesus. So, to put it another way, we can assume that if Jesus doesn't specifically mention and gainsay something in the Old Testament, then the Old Testament laws are still in effect, right? And that is why it's so bloody irritating when some religious folks say, yeah, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and they're just completely ignoring what Jesus himself said. This is the religion of Jesus, not the religion of bloody, the Old Testament, which was written, parts of it were written, a couple of thousand years, I believe, before Jesus was born. Certainly centuries before Jesus was born, the latter parts were written. And this is the religion of Jesus. So those people who say, yes, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, are completely ignoring what Jesus himself specifically said.